Our next speaker, perhaps unwittingly, finds herself a collector of vintage clothing. She is our anthropology collections manager and researcher, Dr. Genevieve Hill.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being with me here on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. I would like to take this moment to acknowledge the support of my colleagues in this very large and very heavy work that we do. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank the ancestors and to show respect to them. It's with great honor that I work with both Ancestral Remains and the belongings that they made. So for obvious reasons, I can't talk today about specific cases. That would be culturally inappropriate. But instead, I'm going to talk about how this research is done here at the RBCM. I'd like to start out by saying that the RBCM no longer accepts ancestral remains. We work with the province, with archaeologists and First Nations communities very, very closely to ensure that every project that happens nowadays has a plan in place, so that if ancestral remains are encountered, they stay on site. They don't come to a place like this. There's no need for that anymore. So to start this program off, back in 2016, the first step was that the government gave $2 million to facilitate the return of ancestral remains and cultural material. This is quite significant because ancestral remains repatriation had been going on at the RBCM since the 1990s, but this was very symbolic that the government was standing behind their commitment to return material and remains to communities. So our first step was to hear from the communities themselves. We had the Indigenous Perspectives on Repatriation conference, where we invited over 200 representatives from over 200 First Nations in the province. And we heard from them about what their wishes were. What sort of things did they actually want repatriated? What were their priorities? So the conclusions that the communities told us were that they wanted to locate, they wanted assistance in locating their ancestral material. They wanted to have greater access to intangible heritage, things like language recordings and photos. And they wanted to facilitate the return of these things to their home communities where they belong. So the second step that we took here at the RBCM was really to show respect and to show our good intentions for the work ahead. Here, as you can imagine, we have ancestral remains upstairs, and they were all treated in a very scientific fashion. So for quite some time, they were stored in plastic bags. One individual or fragments of an individual might have been in multiple bags. They're wrapped in very, protective foam and things like that. And that was all very scientific, but it certainly wasn't culturally appropriate. So with the guidance of some community elders, we worked with them to rewrap all of the ancestral remains. And this was a very ceremonial event. It was closed to the public, but it involved all of the staff. And as you can see on the bottom, this is an example of the material that was removed from the packaging. And above, we have an image of us ripping blanket material so that we can wrap all of the ancestors in individual blankets. And when this happens, now, if communities come to us and ask for their ancestral remains back, many of them will build special boxes for the ancestors. And now we can return them in nice packaging to them that is culturally appropriate, culturally sensitive. So the next step, and the step that has consumed a lot of my time personally, has been to get our own house in order. We have ancestral remains. We currently have representation of about 700 individuals, which is half of the total number we've had over the past. But as I said, repatriation efforts have been underway since the 1990s. So I'm just going to go over for you the different source material that I work with, and to give you a sense of how accurate the material is, how complete the material is, and some of the challenges that we face. So I would say the biggest challenge is identifying where ancestral remains come from so we know who to return them to. And we want to be absolutely accurate in that. There's absolutely no room for us to give them back to the wrong community, so we need to be as accurate as possible. So you can imagine the pressure that comes with doing this research and finding out as much as possible. The first set of sources I'm going to talk about are the early collections. So the museum's been around for over 130 years, and in the early days, a lot of material for the archaeology collection was donated. And it came from people who were out on the land, maybe farmers doing work, or maybe people who were having a picnic near some cairns and decided to take them apart. Sometimes it was people traveling up the coast, sometimes it was missionaries, and people would be either unwittingly or sometimes purposefully removing ancestral remains from communities, from burial grounds, and from archaeological sites like shell middens. So you probably can't read this, you definitely can't read that. But just a little excerpt from one of the early correspondences we found from a fellow who wanted a job here at the museum. He writes, "I'm writing to inquire about the possibility of employment with your institution. Skeletal material is overabundant, if anything. 40 or 50 corpses has been the monthly average for a long time." And then he goes on in this letter to talk about how he's working for the Vancouver Museum in an almost secret position. Nobody talks about it. So you can see that he's appealing to the museum on some sort of academic level, but there are no qualms in this about whether or not what he's doing is culturally appropriate. So a lot of these early records can be somewhat detailed, which really helps us because we want to know where these ancestors actually come from. Some of the early collectors were very, very detailed, with actual individual numbers and individual locations. And some of them not so much. Sometimes we have to go back to notes and journals and figure out where they were in time, if they were a missionary, what was their route up and around the island, or so we try to glean information from that, and it is really a lot of detective work. The second group of source material is things that come from the coroner and the RCMP. So, of course, when I say that, it conjures possibly negative connotations. However, it's very important to note that in many cases that we've looked at, the coroner and the RCMP have actually worked directly with the community. So when I talk about coroner and RCMP reports, I mean that sometimes people are out hiking and they go into a cave and they find ancestral remains. And of course, they don't know if they're old or new. So they report it to the RCMP, and the RCMP brings in the coroner, and so on and so forth. And the connection between the coroner, the RCMP, and the RBCM is that we used to have a physical anthropology department and trained staff who would be able to identify these individuals. So a lot of times the RCMP or the coroner would bring things to us and say, is this modern or is this ancient? And then if it was deemed to not be of current forensic interest, that material stayed here because the RCMP said, well, we don't have jurisdiction to keep it, so it's over to you. So they have moderately good reporting, and sometimes they've drawn little sketch maps of where things come, which is very helpful. And in some cases that I've specifically looked at, the coroner and the RCMP have gone out to site, they have identified ancestral remains, and if there's no threat of looting, if there's some way of protecting it, they'll cover it up and leave it in situ, which is very respectful. The last way, and the way that I personally am most familiar with, is through archaeological excavations. So archaeology really only took off in British Columbia in the 1950s, and it's increased steadily ever since then. The archaeological reports, of course, in the early days were more grand and sweeping with a lot more detail. Nowadays, archaeologists, they have a more intense focus because everything is development driven. So the footprint of the areas they're looking at are a lot smaller. Accordingly, all of the field notes and the osteological analysis, the maps, everything that goes with that is quite detailed. So in most of those cases, we can actually identify the site these ancestors come from. This is extremely helpful, and I should say, as I mentioned at the beginning, that nowadays archaeologists have changed their approach. They work with First Nations communities from the outset. This isn't a sort of catch-up process. They work together from the outset to determine a culturally appropriate way to deal with this. And in the archaeological reports, certainly we can sometimes associate burial features or burial items that could be returned with the ancestral remains. So a little bit about the process and policy that we have here at the RBCM that we've developed. The first thing that guides us is really that Indigenous values and timelines are prioritized in this process. This is a huge shift because for a long time, museum culture has been it's been focused on returning things, but returning things quickly or promptly. And for us, we are guided by the timelines of the Indigenous communities, and we know that not everybody is ready to return these ancestral remains. Returning ancestral remains results in a funeral. Funerals are expensive. Communities have to be ready, and Indigenous communities in this province are faced with so many issues at this moment that it's not necessarily the best time for them to receive them. So what we have done is get our own house in order so that when we talk to communities, as soon as they're ready to repatriate, we can do it the very next day. We're ready to go. And that has been a major, major shift for us. Repatriation of material is unconditional. This is, again, a big shift because in museum communities, often we want the scientific best, the optimal care for objects. But that assumes the understanding that those things are going to be preserved for eternity. And in some Indigenous communities, that's not the desirable thing. They want ancestral remains to be reburied. Sometimes they want cultural material to be reburied. And so in the case of ancestral remains particularly, it's not up to us to say, yes, you guys are ready, and no, you guys aren't ready to receive these ancestral remains because you do or don't have a facility. It's absolutely up to the community, and we are here to acknowledge and support that. What we do find ourselves doing is giving them support, technical support, so that if there is a community that does want to start their own museum, we're here to help them and give them support and advice. One size does not fit all. This is very, very, very important for working with over 200 First Nations in this community. Some communities are large, some small, some have very thorough guidelines about cultural resource management, and others don't. So it's really, really important for us to have developed a policy that is flexible, that allows us to deal with these communities on a case-by-case basis, and that's responsive to everyone in their own special way. The need for sustained and supported relationships is paramount. We at the RBCM have been, some of us for not very many years, some people for over 40 years, have been working very closely with communities, and there's absolutely no replacing that. And lastly, institutional awareness that updated policies are no replacement for relationships. And by that I mean our policies can't be something that we hide behind. They have to be a tool for us to facilitate these returns. And so one of the ways that we have used this policy and this funding to facilitate returns is through the Repatriation Grant program. So we acknowledge that in the past these efforts have been poorly funded, and that it's really significant to support the communities to do this work themselves, not to support the institutions alone, but to make sure that the receiving communities have that support. And so the grant program was established, and we have had our first round of applicants, and it's all been quite successful. And we're waiting to hear whether we have support for this again in the coming future. So with that, I would like to give my acknowledgements and thank you all for your attention.